Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We'll be looking at Galatians chapter 4, just touching at verse 12 a little bit and then getting into verse 13. But before we begin, our theme verse for Lunch with the Lord, Jeremiah 15:16. Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and rejoicing of my heart. Now, as we saw here in verse 12, Paul here says, Brethren, I beseech you, be as I am, for I am as you are. You have not injured me at all. Paul's saying, I'm beseeching you, be like me. I used to be under the law, but I'm not under the law anymore. Be as I am, because I am as you are. As a Gentile, you weren't given the law, and you don't have the law. And I became like you. Now I want you to become like me. It's this circular thing going on here. And Paul is just saying, I want you to go back to the point where you weren't under the law. And maybe you worship these other gods, but you gave your heart to Christ and you served Christ, and now you want to go back to law. You think that serving God is by keeping some laws that God gave to Moses, and it was for the Jews back in the Old Testament, but when Christ came, he dealt with it and he nailed it to the cross and took it out of the way, and now the law cannot hinder us from, the curse of the law cannot hinder us from having a relationship and being right standing with God. So he says, I beseech you, be as I am, for I am as you are. You have not injured me at all. You haven't hurt me. You haven't physically hurt me, mentally hurt me, other than Paul says, I'm afraid of you in verse 11, that you're going back. There was this mental strain on Paul's mind about the Galatians, but he says, you haven't hurt me at all. He said, I'm not injured in any way by this. And then in verse 13, Paul says, you know how through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at the first. And it would seem that from verse 15, the infirmity that Paul is referring to is some kind of sickness with his eyes. Verse 15 says, where is then the blessedness that you spoke of? For I bear you record that if it had been possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. Now, why does Paul say that? And it's believed, we're not sure, that Paul had problems with his eyes, and that the Galatians, when they received Christ and when they loved Paul, that they were so one with Paul that there were Galatians people who, if they could, they would pluck out their own eyes and give them to Paul. So it almost seems like in verse 13 that this infirmity in the flesh that Paul is speaking of is some kind of eye sickness, okay? And there's another point of view. Some commentators seem to think that originally Paul had no intention of preaching the gospel in Galatia, but as he was passing through this region, he came down with this illness and was held in Galatia for some time. He was held up there. He was passing through Galatia, and while he was there, he got sick bad, and he had ended up staying there. And of course, Paul, not one to waste any opportunity, began to preach, and churches were planted there in Galatia, and that's how they started. Now, it's possible, it very well may have happened that way, but I want us to look at a little different view, a little different perspective at what Paul said. Okay? It may have been the eye sickness. He may have been passing through and then come down with another sickness and planted the churches that way. But it may be something else. We don't know. Paul wasn't exactly, didn't give an actual definition as to what the problem was. But I want us to look at it this way. You know, every single pastor or Bible teacher preaches with some kind of an infirmity. It may be an infirmity of their physical body. It may be that it's psychological. Maybe they came from a broken home, or maybe they were abused as a child. Or it could simply be the number one enemy of us all, and that's the old sin nature. Okay? But whatever it may be, every communicator of the Word of God has some kind of an infirmity which they have to deal with. You know, it's been told that many great preachers in the past, some great well-known preachers in the past had terrible problems with depression, anxiety, and some of them had physical ailments, physical problems, and yet God used them tremendously, and they have become great men of God throughout history, and yet they had an infirmity. And you know, every preacher, every communicator of the Word of God has an infirmity. And you may say, well, you look perfectly well. I mean, what's your problem? Well, I may not be physically ailing or anything, but I have an old sin nature, just like you do. You know, we all have problems. We all have weaknesses. We all have some kind of sickness within us. And that's not as an excuse, it's the truth. Remember, we're all sinners. And we live in a sinful body. We are all bound to have something wrong with us. Yet God still uses us, and He speaks through us. It doesn't have to be physical. It can be mental. It can be emotional problems. Everybody's has this old sin nature living within them, and there's always something wrong. Maybe you're physically healthy, but maybe you've got mental problems. Maybe you've got psychological problems. But God uses people, okay, and this is, maybe that's your infirmity, is a mental problem, a psychological problem. But Paul here, it seems like Paul had a physical infirmity. Don't be so hard on your pastor or on the person who's teaching you the Word of God. Don't be so difficult on them. They live in a sinful body. They get tempted to sin just like you and I do. Okay? In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 through 29, Paul here writes to the Corinthians, and he says, "For we see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called." Not just called to be saved, but called to preach also. Called to preach the Word of God. "But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things that are mighty. And base things of the world, and things which are despised has God chosen, yea, and things which are not, to bring to nothing things that are." Why? Why is He doing this? "That no flesh should glory in His presence." That no flesh should glory in His presence. You know, it's not just God calling people to salvation, but it's God calling people to preach the Word of God. This is all He has to use, is sinners. And it's true. Sinners are the only thing that God can use to communicate His Word. And sinners have problems, physical problems, mental problems, emotional problems. Yet we can apply this to the people who God calls to preach the Word of God. Yes, God calls the weak. He calls the humble. He calls the base things of this world not only to be saved, but also to preach the word of God. Don't be so difficult, or don't be so don't be so with your microscope looking at your pastor at every single deed. He's a sinner. He's gonna make mistakes. Can't help it. He's not perfect. He can't be perfect. He wants to be, just like you want to be, but he can't be. And he's going to make mistakes. Going to make a decision down the line somewhere you're not going to agree with. And you're going to look at him, oh, no, that can't be. That's not right. He's not supposed to do that. Well, he did. And you can't help it. This is the way it is. But this is what Paul says here. You know that through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at first. Everybody has an infirmity. Paul said, I came and I had an infirmity, and probably, more than likely, it was physical. And more than likely, it probably was his eye sickness that he had. He probably had terrible vision, couldn't see very well, or whatever it was. But Paul still preached. God still used him, and he blessed them. And God and many people were saved through Paul's preaching. And even though he had that infirmity. Why? That no flesh should glory in the presence of God. No flesh should glory in his presence. All right? Have a great day. Until next lesson. Walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.